Hi everyone, and welcome to this chapter. In this chapter, we're going to talk about InheritedNotifier and ChangeNotifier. As you may have noticed, and if you've watched the previous chapters, you may have noticed that we have quite a few notifiers and builders in Flutter. And it is very important to understand the difference between them because there are quite a few. There's more than half a dozen of these notifiers and builders in Flutter. And for you to be able to create an application that takes advantage of these, you need to understand the difference between each notifier and these builders. So we've talked about value notifier in one of the previous chapters, but a change notifier is kind of like I think actually value notifier is a subclass of change notifier. And we talked about this in one of the previous chapters, but value notifier keeps hold of one value and notifies its listeners when that value changes. And that's why it was kind of a challenge when the value notifier was holding on to a list, because a list's internal changes do not affect the value that the value notifier is actually holding on to. And then we have something called a change notifier. And a change notifier is like a broader class that takes care of notifying its listeners when any change happens in the change notifier. So in this chapter, we're going to also talk about InheritedNotifier. And InheritedNotifier, as you can see, is, you can read a caption. I'm not just going to read a caption for you, but InheritedNotifier works with ChangeNotifier and value notifier so that it notifies its listeners whenever there is a change in those classes. So we're going to use InheritedNotifier, and we're going to use also ChangeNotifier in this application to basically create an app which has a simple slider and two containers that are going to change the opacity based on the slider's value. You'll see that example soon. So let's go ahead and have a look at ChangeNotifier. So I'm going to bring up the code for ChangeNotifier so you can see it as well. So I'm going to bring it here. Let's increase the size quite dramatically. And I'm also going to do some reshuffling on the screen. So if you're on a mobile, you can see it better. You can see here's the source code for ChangeNotifier. And if you read the documentation for ChangeNotifier, it tells you a class that can be extended or mixed in that provides a change notification API using void callback. So a ChangeNotifier tells its listeners that, hey, and those listeners just void callbacks, as the documentation states, that, hey, a change has happened, okay? And there is a function for that in ChangeNotifier. Let's have a look. It's called notify listeners, if you can find that. Here, notify listeners. So if there are 0 listeners, then it just returns. Otherwise, it just goes through all the listeners and calls them and says, hey, you see, goes through the listener at that index and just makes a dynamic call to that listener. So, and this is basically a funky way of calling like void callback. So it's one of the tricks you can do in Dart, basically make any class or anything basically callable. So that's how ChangeNotifier works. It allows you to add listeners, and as you can see, here's the function for add listener. It just adds a void callback, and that's pretty much how it works. Really, it just adds listeners and remove listeners, and it also, of course, can notify listeners. Then we're also, the change notifier is going to hold on to the actual change, for instance, the state of your application. But how do you react to those changes inside of your application? How do you react to those changes that are happening inside of your change notifier? And for that, we're going to use something called an inherited. I can see I've written it incorrectly in the title, so I'm going to change that. Inherited notifier. Bring the title up. So it's just called InheritedNotifier. And we can have a look at the source code for InheritedNotifier as well. So let's have a look at InheritedNotifier. And I really like, what I usually do is when I go to the source code inside Flutter, I usually just start looking at the documentation for it, just thoroughly read the documentation. And you can see in here, it says it's an inherited widget for listenable notifier, which updates its dependencies when the notifier is triggered. So you can basically plug in a listenable in here, which you can see it says T is a listenable and ChangeNotifier is a listenable. I think we can go back to ChangeNotifier and have a look at that. Let's see. Excuse me. You can see it says implements listenable. So, and value notifier is a change notifier. So they're both listenables. And that's what the inherited notifier can listen to. So we're not going to have a look at the entire source code for change notifier and value notifier and inherited notifier, but I strongly suggest for you, excuse me again, to have a look at them in your own time, because I believe personally, and this is an opinion, that if you want to learn Flutter and how it really works, it's important to have a look at just one level deep source code. So not only your source code, which is level 0, just go one level deep, have a look at the source code, which is inside Flutter. You don't have to go into the machine code stuff. You don't have to go into how Dart really works, but have a look at the source code for Flutter and see how that works. So we're going to create a demo application, and it's going to look like this. I'm going to bring my simulator here. This is the application that we're going to develop in this chapter. You can see there's a simple slider in here, and by sliding it, we're only changing the opacity of 2 completely separate containers. So the slider value is our state. It's a double value. We're holding on to a double value inside a change notifier. Very simple change notifier contains a double value. And then we're going to have an inherited notifier that listens for these changes automatically and then rebuilds its children when that particular change happens. All right, so simple application, nothing fancy going on in here, okay? So let's go ahead and create this little application. I'm going to move this here, and let's bring up terminal. I'm going to move simulator out the way as well. We don't need it so much. So let's go ahead in here and create a Flutter project. Flutter create testing inherited notifier underscore course. And I'm going to say organization is SE Pixelity. And this here. So it's going to create the project for us. And I'm going to say testing inherited notifier course, and I'm going to bring up Visual Studio Code to edit the code, and we can close the terminal safely now. We don't need it. So let's go into our main file in here, and we're going to go and create a very simple Flutter scaffold application that has run app, material app, and it has a home page that I believe the home page actually should be stateful. No, actually, in this case, seems it's stateless because, yeah, the data is being kept inside a change notifier. So let's go ahead and create a stateless home page inside this file, basically. So I have a little shortcut for that, or a snippet that creates the home page for me, and it has a scaffold, so it's very, very easy. So what we're going to do in here, let's go ahead and create a little column, which is going to contain our slider, and it's also going to contain our 2 containers. So for that, we need a column. So let's go ahead, and before we do all of this, I'm going to do select device and run our application. While that is happening, we're going to go ahead and create the code for it. So let's say for the body, we're going to say a column, okay? And it has children. The first child of this thing is going to be a slider, okay? And for the value, let's just say 0 to begin with. And for the unchanged, we're just going to add this little function in here, okay? So that's a simple slider. Let's Command S and bring up the simulator to see how our application looks like. It just looks like this, you see? Changing the slider, moving it right and left doesn't actually change its presentation, simply because this is a stateless widget, I believe. Let's have a look. Actually, it is a stateful widget. Interesting. So it's not going to be, so it's not like as I thought. So it's a stateful widget. It's, as I said, it's very important to actually have a look at the source code. Like, you learn something every day. So it's quite humbling to have a look at these. I thought it's a stateless widget and it's a stateful. So, and it's not changing the value simply because we're literally saying the value is 0 every time. So we're not holding on to this value and like changing it on the fly. And that's why this slider is stuck where it is. So the next child of this column is going to be a row that is going to contain our 2 containers. So I'm going to say a container and a color. And I think the other one was yellow on the left. Yes, yellow on the left. So let's say colors, yellow. Okay. And we give it a height of 100. And let's copy this container. And we do another one right next to it. And we say colors, blue, with the height of 100. And this is this isn't really going to work so well, as you'll soon see. So it kind of looks like, yeah, they have no width, and that's the problem, because we could actually say width 100 and another width in here 100, and now they get widths. But the problem is with this row in here, so it cannot really evenly distribute its children. So we're going to fix that. So let's say row's main axis size is main axis size max. All right. And if we remove these widths, it still will have no effect. So there's no intrinsic width in those containers, and we're going to fix that. So there is a way to actually fix that, and that's using the expanded widget. So it would be really great if you could literally at the end of this array, we could just say expand or something like that. So then that would wrap every item inside this list inside an expanded widget. Instead of us having to wrap every single one of them in expanded, we could have a little extension perhaps on list. So let's go and create that little funky extension in here, and let's see if I can find the implementation. So let's just say extension expand equally on iterable of widget. Okay. And I can see we call it iterable of widget, and we say expand equally. Okay. And in this implementation, what we have to do is just map the current iterable. And in here, I'm just going to say widget, okay, and then put it inside expanded. And this child is just that widget, just like that. So it's, I mean, that's really all we had to do. It's not more difficult than that. So after we've done that, we have to go and call that function at the end of this, the children of this row. So let's call that and say expand equally. And remember, the result of this is an iterable. So we have to actually make it a list, because children, again, have a look at the source code, needs list. So we say expand equally, and then we say to list. Okay, so let's have a look at the result. And now we can actually see that the result is looking quite good, I would say, except for the height. Maybe let's change the height to 200 so that it becomes similar to the example. So now our application looks like that. There's no state, no one's holding on to any values, no one's holding on to any opacity or anything. So we need to start storing that opacity somewhere. So we need a change notifier for that. And that is a simple double value. And we're going to have a change notifier that holds onto that double value, and it allows us to read that and also write to that. And for that, we're going to call, our state is going to be a change notifier, and it's going to be called slider data. So let's say class slider data extends change notifier. So remember, this is your state manager. Okay, so this is holding on to the state. All right. So we begin with having our value in here. So we're going to say double, if I can spell, and we're going to call it value, and we're going to say 0. We start with 0, okay? And I've prefixed it with an underscore, simply meaning that this is a private value. All right, so let's create a getter for it. So in here, we're going to say double get value is value. All right, so that's us exposing this private variable using a getter. Also, we need a setter. So anybody who tries to set this value, the important thing is for us to actually notify our listeners of any changes that may have happened in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and say set value, and this is going to be our new value or new value. Okay, and we say if new value is not the same as value, then we say value is new value. And here, the important thing is to say notify listeners. So this is your way of telling anybody who's listening to changes that, hey, something has happened in here. And when I say anybody listening to changes, I really mean our inherited notifier, because inherited notifier is going to hook itself into this change notifier, and then it's going to rebuild its children when the value inside this change notifier has changed, which is a listenable basically in here. If you look at the source code, listenable. So you don't have to use a change notifier. You could use a value notifier. And this is something we could do in here, but I'm just trying to demonstrate to you that a change notifier can also be plugged into an inherited notifier. So how do we access the slider data to set its value? You see, reading the value of the slider data is going to be very easy. We're going to expose a little function on our inherited notifier that is going to read this value for any descendant widgets. However, setting it is going to be a different story. So somehow we need to get access to the slider data's class instance directly so that we can set the value using this setter. There are various ways of doing it. Some people preach different things, but the easiest way of doing that, and one of the most common ways of doing that, is to actually expose this slider data as a global variable. You may want to, excuse me, you may want to put it, for instance, inside your stateless widget if you want to, so that your stateless widget has access to it, and that's completely fine. But I'm just going to go ahead and define it right here. So we're going to define it globally, as I've mentioned. So the way we're going to do that is just to write our slider data in this way. I'm just going to copy and paste some code. Final slider data is equal to slider data. So now we have a way to actually write the value into our slider data. So now that we know that we can set its value, who is actually going to hold on to the slider data? Like, who is going to interact with the slider data and say, hey, when your value changes, I want to rebuild my children. Okay. And that is going to be our inherited notifier. So the inherited notifier is going to be a subclass. For us, is going to, we're going to create an inherited notifier subclass simply that holds on to this slider data. Okay. So an inherited notifier is also a widget. It's actually a proxy widget. And since it's a proxy widget, which is a widget, you can put it inside your widget hierarchy. So we're going to go ahead and create that class right now. So its definition is going to look like that. I'm trying to copy paste some code in here because it's not so important to actually type that by hand. Okay. So there we go. Class slider inherited notifier extends inherited notifier that holds onto slider data. Okay. So this is a widget that says, hey, I'm going to rebuild my child, and you'll soon see that it has a child. I'm going to rebuild my child whenever this listenable that I'm listening to calls notify listeners. Pause the video and think about that a little bit. Slider data calls the notify listeners, as we saw here. Inherited notifier is going to then say, hey, something happened in this value that I'm listening to, and I'm going to rebuild my child. As simple as that. Okay. So let's go ahead and create the constructor for this guy. So I'm going to get help from Visual Studio Code in here. And this is actually a constant constructor. So let's say const and put some comma in here, put a comma in here. So the code is a little bit more readable. So that's the child. We also need an optional key. So let's just say key is key, like that. And then we're going to pass the slider data to this guy. All right. So let's say require slider data. And in here, then we're going to say notifier is that slider data. It's like that. So you can see there is a parameter in inherit notifier called notifier. So that is the listenable. And again, I know that there are so many different words that I'm throwing out there: listener notifier, inherited notifier, value notifier, change notifier, just so many. But just focus on, in this chapter, on change notifier and inherited notifier. Change notifier holds on to the state, inherited notifier rebuilds the child. Okay? Change notifier sits on top, inherited notifier sits at the bottom. Change inherited notifier listens to the change notifier and rebuilds its child when the value of the change notifier changes. All right, so that's really the gist of it. So now that we've done that, you can see that we have a notifier, but how do our descendants actually grab that double value from this inherited notifier? The children of this inherited notifier are going to be notified when the slider data changes value. But how do they get the value? And for that, we're going to use a static function that returns that double value to our listeners. So let's go ahead and actually implement that function. So we're going to say static double of, and we need a build context, okay? And this guy is going to return our, actually let's save this. And we're going to say context depend on inherited widget of exact type, slider inherited notifier, okay? And then this guy is going to be an optional. So let's say optional dot notifier, and you see this notifier is this slider data. So we're literally asking the build context to grab a copy of ourselves, slider inherited notifier, and then we grab our notifier, which is slider data, and in there is this little value guy, remember? So let's just say that one, value, otherwise 0. So let's make also this function an arrow function, so we don't have to return. Okay, so look at this code, please. So the caller of this function is going to give us a build context, and then we're going to say depend on inherited widget of exact type. On that build context, grab our slider notifier or the inherited notifier. If it's present, we grab its notifier, and if that is present, we grab its value. If this whole chain returns null or nil, then we say, okay, we couldn't get the value, we just return 0. Okay. So, I mean, this is a null safe way of grabbing that double value. You could try to unwrap it manually. Like you could just say, like, this is one of the ways of doing it. And I don't really recommend this because we're literally double unwrapping things. First of all, we're unwrapping the slider inherited notifier, force unwrapping it. And then if that doesn't exist, this thing will crash. And then we're unwrapping the notifier and that doesn't exist, it will crash. So I mean, it's an opinion, but I suggest that you actually go ahead and do like I'm doing in here and safely unwrap it with null safety. Okay, now it's time to use the slider inherited notifier. What we're going to do in here is to wrap this entire column with our inherited notifier. So let's just say wrap with widget slider inherited notifier. Okay, and remember we have a required parameter in here, required slider data, and we're going to pass that in here. Let's say slider data is slider data. Okay, because we have the slider data defined globally here, remember, right? So, and then we have our slider inherited notifier using that slider data. As simple as that. Okay. So we've already added this part, so I don't have to explain this. Slider data is passed here. No problem with that. Then what we need is once the slider actually changes its value, we are going to set that on our slider data. Okay, so let's go ahead in here and call set, and basically on here, it's just say slider value, slider data dot value is equal to value. And remember, where we say slider data dot value is equal to this slider value, we're calling the set function on this value. So if I command click on it, you see it goes actually to set value. And I'm doing command click because I'm on a Mac, but you can control click if you're on Ubuntu or if you're on Linux or Windows. So on this slider's value changing, we're literally just immediately calling the set value or yet the value setter on our slider data and passing this value to that. Okay, so that part is very, very easy. And what we're then going to do is to wrap these containers that we have in here. Actually, let's see, hook the slider's value to opacity widgets. Okay, so what we're going to do in here then is to wrap these containers, as I was saying, inside a widget called opacity. As you saw in the example, when we change the slider's value, when we move the slider to the right and left, these containers were getting a specific opacity. So from 0 to 1, perhaps, okay? So let's wrap these containers inside a widget called opacity, all right? And this one in opacity as well. And in here, it says, okay, what is the opacity? Now, this is the important part. How do we get that double value from our inherited notifier? Remember, when we developed inherited notifier, we added this function, static double of, That's the way to do it. So let's go ahead in here and say, what do we call it? Slider data notifier or something. Slider data, or what do we call this? Slider inherited notifier. Slider inherited notifier of context, and then we get is value. Did we call it value? Oh, context. I think that's it. That was it, really, because the off function actually returns a double. So in here, I'm going to do the same thing for this opacity. I'm going to say that same thing in there. And we also have set the opacity. So the setting the opacity is done here on changed. All right. So this is very interesting because we're kind of done with this demo, but it's not going to work. And I'll show you why. And actually, I'll first show you that it's not working. I'll do a hot restart. And let's go in here. You can see that even with a hot restart, wait a minute, value here should be the slider value. So we can't really use that. So let's just use this double value in here. Oof, like that, hot reload. Actually, maybe a hot restarts in order. Can't even change that. So slider data value is equal to value. And then we're getting the value in here. Okay, well, that makes sense, yeah. So this is what I meant by that it's not going to work. So you may be thinking, well, we are setting the value and the slider inherited notifier is actually, yeah, it should kick in. Like it should actually understand that the value is being changed and it should like rebuild its children. However, there's a little bit of a problem in here. We are, in fact, hitting this 0 in here. And the problem is that the inherited notifier, which is here, using this particular build context, it can't be found. And I'll show you what the actual issue is. The build context that we're using is being passed to the build function of our homepage. At that point in time where that build context was created, there was no slider inherited notifier in the context. So now we have a little bit of a problem. We have the context and we have the notifier, which is built after the context was built, but all its dependents are depending on that notifier to be present in that context that was created before the notifier. And this is a great place and a good lesson for using a builder. So a builder will allow you to grab a fresh part of the context after the build function itself is called. So what we need to do is to go and wrap this little column inside a builder. And this context will in turn include the slider and inherited notifier because it's created after. So a lot of people ask me, why would you need builder? Where is it useful? I don't understand where it's useful. And now you know, because a builder's context includes not only the context that was inside the build function above it, but it also includes all data and inherited widgets that were created after that build function, just before the builder. So in between, sandwich in between. So let's Command S, and we perhaps are missing a comma here because the formatting was a little bit crazy. So we have the builder. And what we need to do is to have a look at a demo. So you can see in here, if I change the slider value now, the builder is holding on to, this builder is giving us a context that does have this inherited notifier in it, and changing the value of the slider is then subsequently is affecting the opacity value in here. So that was a little demo, and I hope you learned something from this chapter, having a look at inherited notifier and also ChangeNotifier. So what is then the difference between inherited notifier and an inherited widget that we've talked about in one of the previous chapters? Well, whereas an inherited widget holds on to its own values, an inherited notifier doesn't do that. As you saw, an inherited notifier is dependent on something called a notifier, and that notifier is listenable, such as ChangeNotifier or value notifier. So an inherited notifier doesn't itself contain its value. In short, you could say that's the difference between inherited notifier and your inherited widget. So now that we've done this, let's commit and tag our code as we usually do. I'm going to go to terminal in here and just say git status. We don't have a git repo, so let's git init, git add all, or you could say git add A like that. And then we're going to commit this and say step 1. And let's tag it as well. Git tag step 1. Oops. Just like that. Okay. Now, in this chapter and in all the previous chapters, we've learned quite a lot about how Flutter itself manages state and what mechanisms Flutter exposes to developers for managing states. And I wanted to start the course, to be honest with you, by going through what Flutter already offers, because a lot of people jump into using a package such as block or provider without actually understanding how Flutter itself works with change notification. So I think it's very, very important that you have a look at these internal and built-in mechanisms that Flutter provides. That's my opinion, and it's not a fact. I'm just saying that if you want to jump into moving provider or block or any other package out there, please first learn how Flutter itself works and how its internals work and how change notification works and value notifiers work. So without that knowledge, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for you to jump into another package and learn how that package works, because almost every package out there, I think except for block and maybe one or two more, they're working with inherited widget, inherited notifier, value notifier, change notifier. They're kind of working with build context. They're almost doing exactly what Flutter does, but they're doing it in a bit more of a coherent way. They're doing it in more like a thorough way that is throughout the entire package. It's the same system being used. So that's just my opinion. So please have a look at these chapters that I prepared for you, go through them and learn how Flutter itself works before moving on to the next chapters. So there's a lot more to explain from this chapter on. We're going to be talking actually, I can't say that because I may add more chapters that discusses Flutter's internals. So I can't say from this chapter on, but in the upcoming chapters, we're going to talk about some third-party packages such as provider and block. So stay tuned and I'll hope to see you soon.